house on Deadwood, and the clock stopped. The house on Deadwood didn't look like it belonged to any ordinary map of endings. It looked as if time itself had left a chair and a coat behind. Evelyn stood under the crooked porch and counted the steps, said the numbers to herself like a litany, looking for the small comfort of order. The brass face of the grandfather clock showed 3, forever arrested at an hour that felt less like a measurement than a memory. A cold corner pooled behind her, and even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing the threshold. Inside, the house smelled of dust and paper like a library that had learned to keep secrets. Evelyn ran fingers along a mantel rim and found fingerprints older than her own, faint oils pressed into the wood. The clock did not move. When she set her palm against the case, a faint vibration that belonged to memory, not mechanics, felt like a pulse. She told herself this was inheritance and obligation, repair boards, settle bills. But the rooms answered with little mismatches. A rug slightly off-center, a single shoe tucked under a chair, as if a person had simply stepped away. Mrs. Halpern visited at dusk with a tin of biscuits and eyes like ledger marks. "You must be careful of the corners," she said, which sounded indistinct until Evelyn learned she meant more than drafts. The neighbor spoke of the house as though it were an old acquaintance who had outlived a series of friendships, cheerful, patient, and prone to remembering things for you. She mentioned the latter once, in passing, always propped at dusk, always gone by morning. Evelyn laughed and set the biscuits on the table, feeling watched by a kindness older than the town's streetlights. The attic trunk yielded a small archive of lives, letters bundled with faded ribbon, photographs with faces cropped by time, a child's shoe with the toe worn down to a smooth crescent. Every envelope was addressed in the same careful hand, sometimes to a name Evelyn didn't recognize, sometimes to her mother. The letters read like instructions, written sideways, little notations, half-remembered recipes, a line crossed out as if the writer had changed their mind mid-sentence. One note, folded small and heavy with intent, simply listed a time 3 and nothing else. Nights drew long at Deadwood. Evelyn began waking to minor repetitions. A wooden spoon found precisely where she'd left it the night before. Then again, a night later, the heater clicking twice before settling. A floorboard sigh at the same cadence each midnight. She tried to catalog these small faults like a scientist. When she marked a calendar square and slept with the window cracked, she dreamed of a hallway that unfolded onto itself, a wallpaper pattern that repeated with tiny variations like a liar's tattoo. Always the dreams ended at a door that opened to a brass clock face frozen at 3. The latter appeared one evening without announcement, aluminum bright against the dim siding. Evelyn found it leaned like a casual promise and carried it to the attic out of habit, repair, inspect, impose reason. Halfway up, her hand grazed an oil-stained rung, and the sound the house made then was not at all like creaking wood. It was a gasp, a small, private inhalation, as if someone on the other side of the ceiling had remembered to breathe again. She froze, fingers white on the metal, and imagined a life taking inventory of her, like a housekeeper checking blotted names against a list. Letters continued to accumulate in odd places. One slipped between a cookbook and a shelf, another tucked beneath a teacup. Each carried the same careful hand, the same tendency to stop mid-thought. The words that survived were small acts: leave the window cracked, do not wind past 3 instructions that read like a map through a weather warning. The more she followed them, the more the house softened into familiarity. The fewer she followed, the more it corrected her, bringing a teaspoon exactly to the left of a plate, or setting the clock's minute hand lazily lifting toward resistless stillness. Evelyn began to suspect the house didn't so much want company as it wanted continuity, the documentation of small choices stored like receipts. When she asked Mrs. Halpern about the clock, the neighbor's face folded. "It stopped when he left," she said, grammar like a bruise. "He went at 3. Some things hold to the exact hour they were broken." Evelyn pressed for a name, a reason, any anchor, but Halpern only tapped her ledger and said, "You don't fix what remembers you. You teach it to forget." The advice felt both like mercy and a threat. One evening she wound the clock because stubbornness had become its own superstition. Her fingers found the key in a drawer, metal with a familiar weight, and she turned until resistance sang like a held breath loosening. The pendulum swung once, and then the house exhaled longer than a draft, like a secret collapsing into the room. For hours, nothing obvious happened, but the next morning, she woke to a cup of tea cooling on the kitchen table that she had never made, steam curdled at the rim as if waiting. The house was learning the language of reciprocity. With that swing came a narrowing of patience. Times of day began to blur. She missed appointments she had set, woke before alarms, and sometimes paused mid-sentence, as if the house had folded the conversation into a pocket between walls. Sound collected and replayed itself. A stair creak returned 3 minutes later in a different room. The neighbor's porch light blinked twice and answered itself down the lane. Paranoia looked like detail. It could be catalogued. A lid left upright, a shadow that repeated the same hesitation at the base of a staircase. The house kept keeping its accounts. Evelyn found a photograph in the trunk she had missed before. A man turned away, the light catching his collarbone like a promise. On the back, in the same careful hand, was one sentence: "I will be back by 3 if I can." The sentence sat underlined twice. She read it so often the ink melted into a drumbeat. At 3 each day, she felt the house pause, as if meeting an appointment that had been standing for decades. She began counting the minutes like a patient audience, waiting to see whether the absent person would keep a vow she had no right to enforce. On the day she meant to leave, she locked the door, but the world outside had thickened into a rumor. The Deadwood sign at the lane's mouth looked more rusted than usual, letters losing their faces as if erasing themselves politely. She paused, keys in hand, and heard the house move, not a creak, but a shuffle, as if it were rearranging furniture inside its chest. The thought of closing the door behind her felt like severing a conversation. She wondered whether time would follow her on the other side, or whether the house would continue on, quietly holding the hour it knew best. She left the key on the mantel instead and went back to wind the clock once more. The pendulum found its rhythm with a sound like a locked drawer opening. At 3, the house held its breath, and then, impossibly, the minute hand quivered and moved forward by a single shallow degree. The change was slight, as if someone had nudged the world on its hinge. Evelyn listened for a chorus or a thunderous unfastening, and heard only the soft thrum of the house learning to be continued. She did not know whether she had freed it or bound herself deeper into its ledger. The last thing she did before dusk was step to the doorway and look down the lane. The ladder leaned where it had leaned the first night she arrived. The Deadwood sign looked patient. Whether the house would keep remembering at 3, or whether the clock would continue to demand an hour she couldn't reclaim, she couldn't say. She closed the door gently, leaving the light behind, and as she turned the handle, the sound she heard was not a footstep, but a small thoroughfare of soft noises, pages turning, a spoon settling, the house performing its endless domestic rituals. She walked away with the certainty that she had not left it alone. Somewhere, in the brass face of a stopped clock now nudged toward motion, the house kept its watch,